This is the logistics part of getting set up for the first panel discussion. All right. Testing. Mine works.
Testing.
Yeah.
Dustin.
Hello? Oh, yes.
Do we have two greens? Braden and Liz, are you both green? Oh. Two blues.
Two blues.
Okay, I guess it doesn't matter.
And I'm gonna wear my jacket. I think, is everyone chilly? Whatever, I almost wrote my presentation, so I almost wrote in there.
Yeah.
It's like, oh yeah.
We didn't tell you, you're all patient zero in our cryonics experiment. Yes, that's right, you didn't wake up.
We're just preparing you to know what it'll be like.
So this is our first panel discussion, and as I was listening to each of you speak, my mind went back to my childhood when I used to do this thing called video games. And back in my day, video games, you went to an arcade and they had these big, giant, tall video games, and you would put a quarter in the video game, and your avatar, the digital representation of yourself, would come to life, right? And at any point in that game, you could put 2 or 3 more quarters in, and that would extend your life. But most of us don't play that way, or we think, oh, I'm just going to, put in 1 quarter and I'll play the game and I'll be fine, until something happens. Your little avatar falls over, and then you see flashing on the screen, 10, 9, 8, and you reach into your pocket. I know I've got a quarter in here. 7, 6, 5. Oh, here, I found the quarter. 3. Do I drop the quarter? 2, 1. Oh, time's up. And I think that this discussion, it reminds me of that, because we tend to think about all of these things when our time is running out, when our time is up. And yet maybe there are things that we can do to keep putting quarters in the machine throughout the game. And so just kind of to start us out, do you have any thoughts, and this tags on to Seth, kind of what you're saying, do you have any notion of how long you want to live?
Well, it's interesting to get this question first, because I feel I'm still young enough to feel like I'll probably live forever anyway. But I think one of the really interesting things that I've experienced while really just talking to transhumanists and kind of going to meetings with them is the kind of borderline ascetic practices that actually go along with being a transhumanist, of completely avoiding certain kinds of foods, especially those that might, kind of inflame your body. Looking into all the latest research and really trying to tease through it of calorie counting, of being very, very specific of when you eat your meals, and trying to optimize all those parts of yourself. And it, as someone who's studied theology, of thinking back to the practices of monks with their particular diets and very sparse food.
I like the beer diet. It's actually a monk diet.
Okay. Well, what's interesting though is that I know a lot of transhumanists who won't drink. So this doing all these kinds of practices to be able to live long enough is a very kind of practical, embodied thing for many of these people. And what's even more interesting is that it's kind of to get to that escape velocity in which they will no longer need a body. So kind of focusing on your body so much now to not have to focus on it later is very peculiar to me.
So how long do you want to live?
How long do I want to live? The thought of living eternally has never really appealed to me, but I would like to keep living for maybe 100 more years. If I could play sports indefinitely, I might be more for it, but we'll see.
Liz, how long do you want to live?
Well, I get asked that a lot because I stepped up and did this treatment, but I didn't do it to try to live forever. I did it to try to spearhead cures for kids. and for the rest of the world. But I do have to say, when I'm asked that question, I don't foresee a good day to die. So, and you know, regardless of faith and background, people spend over 80% of the money that they spend on healthcare when they get that final diagnosis. So we know that other people choose for life too. So I choose for life, and I know that. I know that I choose for it today. I assume that I would choose for it in 100 years. I really like this experience. And you know, in order to keep people from not putting in the quarter till the end, you know, we're hoping that those gene therapies that I showed you will be used like kind of like immunizations against aging long before you get sick, so that hopefully we start to front end some of the choices that we make instead of doing them when it might be too late. So I choose for life.
As long as possible, what it sounds like.
For today, absolutely.
Braden, how about you? How long you want to live?
Yeah, I think it's again, it's a question of negative freedom in the sense of, I think what is trying to happen is we're trying to get to the point where we can make that decision, where it's not an unexpected death, that we actually can control when that is, whether that's 20 years from now, whether that's 200 years from now. It seems that it's that being able to make that decision, to have that decision, and which makes society different in a way. If we think about what the unintended or even the intended loss of life would look like in the future, in a world where you can choose when you want to die, how much more heinous of a crime does murder become?
Oh yeah, and then just to that point, you know, some people talk about they already are starting this mental restriction on what we can do with this technology, and they're saying, well, should people be able to live very long? And to me, making that choice for someone else is like murder. When do you cap somebody else's life? So that's even a more interesting question. You know, should we do that?
It was a great Justin Timberlake movie. Not because he was in it, but because it treated that same subject, and you saw this kind of, I would call it a digital divide between those who had longer lifespan and those who were denied longer lifespans on the basis of income and class. And that kind of transitions to something that I've been wanting to ask you, because I know that part of your story and part of your reason for going to Columbia to do this was frustration with the restrictions and the limitations of the regulation process here in the United States, or at least I'm assuming that was the case. What is appropriate oversight and regulation? What is the function of a society and a community in saying, okay, you know, maybe we're not doing it well right now, but what would that look like, in your opinion, if we were doing it well? And then I'll let others answer that.
Oh yeah, so I believe in agency and autonomy, and I believe that you should have the right to do with your body what you wish, but we don't suggest that anybody does, you know, gene therapy or biohacking in your home. So we have a network of medical doctors, we do things in medical hospitals, and everyone who participates has to do informed consent, which means several videos that they have to watch and a lot of reading that they have to do. I think that I would really love to bring this technology back to the United States. The problem that we have right now is we have two areas of use. One is compassionate care, and patients have to do, and doctors and companies have to do a whole bunch of paperwork, and the patients usually die before they get access to the medicine. The other one is right to try. If something has failed, at least in phase 1, which you don't really want a failing drug, you can use it, but then the company that gives it to you does not have to report on whether it worked or not. So now we could have like 50 patients all going to try to use the same drug with no reporting. They might all be dying. So I think that we can do something better and more innovative in the U.S. And I think a few years of our medical tourism running with our U.S. bioinformatics company, we're going to be able to show the U.S. government that we have a better way to do medicine that expedites innovation. We want to be the most innovative country in the world, and we want to help patients. And we have enough patients in need right now that this would be beneficial to the United States.
Braden, is there a negative freedom approach to regulation of health technology?
Well, it's interesting because I was just talking with students this week about compassionate care in terms of treatment for Ebola. And it's that question is, if you're dying, there are ways you can change the clinical protocols. And I think that within the transhumanist view, I think there are a lot of transhumanists who would say that's what's happening.
We're all dying all the time.
If you're getting in the way of this research, you are, in fact, not allowing people to live the life they could. And so I think that this, in a way, is one way in which you can sort of push back against the current clinical trials to try and imagine a way of how do we go about doing this properly, ethically, with oversight, but in a way that allows us to try and tackle things before they become a problem.
Yeah, definitely. So within the transhumanist circles I'm familiar with, there's two main approaches, which is a democratic approach, which I think is, so James Hughes at UMass Boston is probably the biggest proponent of this particular view, which basically says, well, some regulation is necessary, especially for getting people equal access to different kinds of enhancements, right? To avoid a kind of dystopian situation in which only certain people have access to say, gene therapy and other kinds of treatments. The second one is kind of an anarchist libertarian view in which it's just kind of a free-for-all. And I think there's a real tension between these two views, especially on this issue of bodily autonomy. Because I think even Hughes, right, who's in favor of democratic transhumanism, would say that bodily autonomy is very important. But as we can see within our own society, bodily autonomy is an incredibly broad issue in terms of how individual rights infringe upon the community and things like that. So trying to navigate those kinds of issues, especially as we don't quite yet have all the kinds of knowledge to be able to make all these kinds of decisions, especially with, say, people doing ongoing treatments of themselves. And particularly transhumanists feel like things aren't moving fast enough, so why not experiment on yourself even if you're not sure what it would do? So it can be incredibly complicated, but I think that bodily autonomy is the key issue there.
Yeah, I would say the opioid epidemic is a good example of where do you draw the line with bodily autonomy, that when it becomes a community concern, when it begins to affect other people, and I don't know if that has an intersection with this or not. But this would probably be a good time to open up to questions. And so if you have questions that you'd like to ask, we can bring a microphone to you.
I want to thank all the panelists, and glad it's been a great talk so far. I have a question actually on the title, which is no longer there, but of the panel, which was about the image of God and genetic engineering or something.
Yeah, image of God or genetic engineering.
That's it. Oh, wow, that's good. And I think the problem sometimes when we have conversations about the image of God is that we tend to see it as a fixed thing. That image of God is humanity and it's very fixed, and there's really no room for expansion of that. And if we start taking science seriously about evolution and the human image, that humanity becomes more flexible and more fluid, how do we discuss the image of God in humanity, assuming that or accepting the fact that humanity is more fluid, given that we weren't always the way we are today?
I kind of try to tackle that. At least one thing that I've thought in the last couple of days, especially when I saw that this panel was titled, and I forgot, but saw that it was titled The Image of God and Genetic Engineering, I wonder if there's a paradigm or a way to look at the genome as, we've always said as people of faith and Christianity that the image of God resides in what? In your soul, in your spirit? What if it resides in your DNA? And in that case, part of one of the goals of genetic engineering is maybe an attempt to bring us back to that more perfect image of God that is already within each of us and is passed down through our genes, our mutated genes. You could even look at genetic mutation and maybe tie it to a doctrine of original sin in some way. But that's just off the cuff. What do you think?
I think it's a really interesting question. So, I think that I go back to what my chemistry teacher said, which is, that there seems to be a purpose in everything that we do. So we were handed this very important information of the A, T, C's, and G's that we're made of. And we know that they're changing. They're changing through mutation. Some of them are changing for the worse. Some of them are changing potentially for the better. We integrate viruses. About 8% of our genome is, recent viruses that we have integrated. So we're getting gene therapies done to us anyway. So we've been given, by example, how a species evolves. So, I think that it's a careful subject, but I would say that just much like the William S. Burroughs quote, we don't know who we are supposed to be. And I imagine that humans 200 years ago would look at us and think that we are not the same humans anymore. And I imagine that we will look forward at our self-evolved selves and look back and think the same thing. So, we know genes associated with empathy and various other areas that might be super beneficial to some of the population who might be lacking in the ability to feel for others. And just these general evolutions of getting people closer and creating more of a knit society could be highly beneficial. But what I'm trying to say, for the most part, to the question is that I don't think that we should think that we are done yet. I think we were handed really important tools, and I think that we're supposed to use them, and anything short of that would just be wrong. But that's fine.
Sure. Traditionally in theology, there's probably about 4 different ways to think about the image of God. Sort of a substantive thing, that it's a trait or characteristic that we share with the divine. Or it's a functional definition, where it's a role that we have. Typically it's been stewardship of creation. Transhumanist conversations, we could look at not only stewardship, but maybe even shepherding even new things. Then there's the relational aspect, just as God is relational in terms of the Trinity. That's part of what it also means to be human. Or the elective, that God chose humans to bear the image of God. I think that you're absolutely right, that human nature is malleable, and that that's something we need to take into account. And so I think, honestly, the person who's probably best suited to answer this would be Ron Cole Turner, who we'll hear from later, who would assign the image of God more to the lineage of humans, so not just Homo sapiens sapiens, but Neanderthals and who we will become as well. So that would be my short answer.
So image of God is a thread that runs through it. You were speaking of how our ancestors might look at us and not recognize us, but we can still see commonalities, and likely we'll still be able to see commonalities. And so maybe the image of God is that thread that connects us to them and to whatever comes next.
Yeah, and the image of God is incredibly important to define, in part because when medieval theologians think of the image of God as something like rationality, something that specifically makes us different from animals, that's something that, say, I don't know, a future AI could participate in conceivably, right? But also that our increasing scientific understanding would be making us more into the image of God in that kind of definition, right? Because to become more rational would be to become more like God. So I do feel like it is important to understand that history, and especially because I think most people say have a more formal sort of understanding of the image of God just because it's very intuitive. But there have been different ways of understanding it over time that are very compatible with the transhumanist vision.
I'd go back to Jonathan's talk too and say, sometimes the language that we use, that we try to interpret the most literally as possible, can also be analogous, can be good analogy and inspiration too. Yes, question?
Yeah, thanks again for your contributions. This is just a follow-up to that, maybe asking far too specifically. But is there any work or authors that you're aware of who's dealing with this idea of genetic therapy and moving that as divinization or theosis, with kind of that Eastern Orthodox view of that? Is that more Teilhard Chardin? I mean, is there anybody you know that we could be reading on that?
I mean, it's not a theological point of view necessarily, but the first person that comes to my mind is Ray Kurzweil, who describes the process of evolution as the universe waking up, right, which is a kind of divinization of a different sort. Any response?
The CTNS journal Theology and Science recently, within the past year, had a special issue on whether or not we can genetically create virtue. And so there were folks from a Roman Catholic and Protestant perspective on virtue ethics, but then also theosis and divinization from an Orthodox perspective. So that's probably off the top of my head where I'd start.
What was the name of that?
The journal's Theology and Science. You can search for the special issue.
Thank you again, panel. So we've only recently begun to appreciate neurodiversity as a concept, right? And I wonder, like, what is your take? What is the role of Christianity in making sure that as we gain more control over our own biology, we don't end up erasing diversity? Even from like autonomous choices, such as a person on the autism spectrum wanting to fit in and thus removing what can potentially make them an amazing scientific contributor.
I guess I would start with saying that I would look to the deaf community as an example of a precursor for this. That there are folks that say that this is part of our identity, that there's nothing wrong, this is not a disability, and yet there are still individuals who want to restore what they would see as normal function. So I would look to that as maybe a case study of how we could start to do with neurodiversity. But again, the Christian's role is to bring up the marginalized, the people who aren't willing to speak, the people who aren't willing to be a part of that conversation, and to make sure that they are still valued.
I think it's about giving opportunity and option. So if somebody who has autism wants to experience life not in that set, and they have the potential to do that, then it is our obligation, as much as it is our obligation, if we create something that is an enhancement, that everyone has the opportunity to participate in it as well. So, I mean, number one, you want to even the playing field so that, you know, children have as much health as the healthy adults in this room, and then healthy adults in this room have a better advantage of health, and they each share in that responsibility. So what I see the real strength in the Christian area, this whole movement, is what we really need in the world, which is bringing people together on a different level. So I think that with this type of technology and this type of biology, we'll be able to solve a lot of these problems. The thing that we're not solving is bringing people together and having a world worth living in for a long time with each other. So probably people mostly know that, I mean, I wasn't raised religious. I don't have that basis, but I do have this strong need to be part of people coming together for people, for the betterment of people. And without that, I don't know how we'll have longevity. So we need to take care of each other. We need to take care of the environment. And I'm a person that, you know, since I came into this area, I have stalkers. I've had people put up defamatory websites that aren't even true, because they're insulted by this technology. And it made me even realize more how we need each other. And so I'm not sure that answered your question of neurodiversity. I think we need to level the playing field, bring everybody up, and give everyone the option that they can choose for themselves. But as far as the group and the movement in general, we need each other.
What does a 2,000-year-old community bring to a very new and very young community, the transhumanist community? I would say whether you take the stories literally or whether you take them figuratively, we have great stories, and we have a lot of experience inspiring people through those stories and drawing on that tradition, those texts that inform us, and we have a lot of experience doing that. And so maybe in some ways, whether it's helping people who are not yet on board or are struggling with the transhumanist project, but there's a way that people in the Christian transhumanist community can translate, can say, okay, well, you know, we've been talking about eternal life for a long time, or at least life that is full and abundant for a long time, and so there's an analog there.
You're the original immortalists, is what I always say.
I think the Egyptians may have to be a little bit of that.
Well.
How are we doing on time and questions? Micah, somebody want to answer that? Until I hear it stop, I'm going to keep on going.
Thank you. This is directed specifically to Seth, only because I went to school in Boston too. How is the transhumanism movement, especially Christian transhumanism movement, doing as far as outreach to minorities and minority communities, especially the more conservative ones? I notice as a Hispanic, whenever I talk about this, there's a huge pushback. Like, these people are trying to take away who we are, as how we view God, and they're trying to take away. I remember having a discussion with a pastor, and he said, "Well, what do you need heaven for if you have this?" And it seems like there's a disconnect between understanding what this really is and how it affects, especially people who have a more conservative view of religion. So I wonder if you could speak to that.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like I have a lot to say on this topic in particular. So first off, I would just want to say that most transhumanists are male and white. And those demographics kind of match the larger kind of atheist, agnostic, secular demographics. Or I think they even get a little bit more extreme within transhumanist circles. And my kind of anecdotal experience would very much support those sort of demographic breakdowns in terms of almost all the white communities are with white men. In terms of this question of outreach to people of color, one of the reasons why I brought up the photo that I did is in part because there's a kind of person who's being left out of that vision almost all the time, right? A person whose kind of work is not really imagined. And so, for instance, back when I was in Los Angeles, because I deal with religion and science issues, one of the things I think about a lot is, say, kind of evolution curriculum and kind of the hesitancy of, say, Mexican immigrants to send their kids even to high school because they're afraid that their kids will no longer, say, want to be a part of their church community. And it was actually very comforting to me to find out, well, I mean, not comforting at the fact, but that people's intuition about this is correct, right? That they're sensing something that's real, that's happening in their communities. It's not an unfounded fear. As people tend to get more educated, they tend to fall out of the church. And so, I know that might seem kind of strange, but it was incredibly validating to be like, things that my parents are worried about, things that people I grew up were worried about, those things were actually true, right? And so in a lot of religion and science circles, we can kind of try to talk around the sort of tensions that there are, but that's a very real concern, in part because to take on these ideas, and especially the ways in which we understand our own communities, those things aren't always compatible in a straightforward way. And I feel like deliberately talking about that as a real problem, rather than as something that's not a problem, is the only way to start to move forward.
Other questions?
Well, those statues.
I guess my question would be, as you were talking about our stories, and our stories are supposed to be divinely inspired, so what is the role then of divine inspiration in this, and how do we recognize it as such?
Any takers? What's the role of divine inspiration?
Well, I think I'd go back to presentation that we started with, and the question of, is it only God? Is it ex nihilo 2.0? Is it just us, or is it sort of this combination? I think the model of created co-creator, and that part of what it means to be divine is to have that creative impulse, and that's going back to the image of God. That is something that we have, whether it's trying to improve ourselves, whether to try and create something new, either through transhumanism or through artificial intelligence. That's something that humans have always strived to do, and to me, that's where I see a spark of the divine. Now, whether or not you can say for sure this is something that God would intend, I think there has to be resonance then with the stories and the tradition that we say. And so for me, I would go back to that test of beneficence versus negative freedom. Is this something that's going to help individuals in society and our group as a whole, rather than is this something that I want to do for any particular reason, for selfish reason maybe. So I would say that natural impulse, but also consonance with the tradition.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, I think that's an internal, external question. Certainly for those who claim those stories as our own and see them as divinely inspired, that's an easy question to answer, but I think we also have to realize that we're not alone in the world, that there are others outside of our tradition who do not see our stories as divinely inspired, but can still be inspired by them. And so we, as a Christian community, have something valuable to bring to the table, and all the more so because we do believe that they are divinely inspired. We believe that they must be brought to the table in any conversation about science and the community and its development. We are breaking for lunch at 12 o'clock, right? So it is, I've got 5 till. Were there any housekeeping things that needed to be made before we break for lunch? Or I saw a hand.
I have a question.
Yes.
If you don't mind. Greetings, everybody. I'm Cheryl Renee Moses. So one thing I want all of us to think about before we go to break, when we talk about gene, all of recreating and getting the best of, right? We know that people of color, Africans, African Americans like myself, when we talk about this gene work, we have to also consider whether there's going to be a mission of eliminating all people of color. Is it going to be that you're looking to have an all-white population? These are things that we do need to think about and recognize that on Sunday, that's the most segregated time of the hour, church. So as we're here today, this is a gathering and we're talking about making a better world. Well, God is not a respect of person. And in God's eye, all of us are equal, 100%. And with that being said, I would like for us to think about other folks who are who would be affected by all of this conversation, all of the science, all of this, and even making sure diverse folks are included in the trials, because science that relates to Caucasians are not specific to Africans, and recognizing that, you know, modern Homo sapiens all originated from Lucy, from Africa. That is a fact. We talk about science, and when we talk about science and God, God created science, and so to me this is just confirmation that there is a creator, but we have to be responsible, and in order to be responsible you have to have inclusive perspectives, right? So it has to be somebody from various communities coming together at the same round table, bringing, you know, issues, challenges, even as far as science. We need to have those discussions collectively and not just a silo of folks pushing forward one agenda.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that this area is vastly underrepresented by minorities. And that's a really important part of the conversation. Of course, when we're looking at regenerative gene therapies, these are gene therapies that will work in all of the population, and the people who are coming forward to have these early discussions are just the ones who are struggling in to have the conversation. And so we do need to diversitize that. So what I'm trying to say by that is we wouldn't want to halt a cure to have a conversation, but we certainly don't want anyone thinking on the lines that this technology will lead to something like genocide or things like that. I think that genetic engineering is going to actually lead to probably more differences between people than similarities. I think there's like kind of that subset group of people who think they want to be like Barbie and Ken, Caucasian Barbie and Ken. But there's a huge miraculous array of people who are actually would make very different choices. And so I think that this will help us celebrate diversity, and I know, like you know, that we are all originated from Africa. I think that nobody has a debate about that. I think that I know that you are a beautiful person. I think that you know that we all have value together, and we really do have to come out of this segregation time, and we need to talk about these bigger issues, especially as we get into physical enhancements outside of health issues. What do people choose for? And that's why, you know, statistically in boards, when people were asked about children, if you had a child and you could genetically modify them to not have health issues, or if you could modify them for appearance, more people felt that it was acceptable to modify them for health reasons rather than appearance, because that's such a touchy zone. What is beauty? Beauty is everything. Beauty is you, me, and everybody else in this room. And yet, through the media and through divisiveness, we do not share that story with the world. So we have a lot of issues, and again, a lot of them come down to social issues and value of one another, and that's what I really hope to be part of in the future.
I'd say that's also another good reason why Christians and Christianity should be present at this table. It's something that we have to offer. We don't have a flawless track record by far on inclusivity, but there are certainly moments that when we are called to the very best of what our stories teach us, what our scriptures teach us, that we are moving closer and closer to that kind of inclusivity. And because that is an inherent, or should be an inherent value of our faith, that's something that we can bring to, I think, this transhumanist conversation that doesn't necessarily, and someone correct me if I'm wrong, but my sense or my feeling of transhumanism is that it doesn't have a very well-defined narrative or core set of values. Maybe libertarianism to some extent, but libertarianism is not quite the same thing as saying, no, we need to take care of those who, and we need to welcome and draw in those who are marginalized in our world. And so that's something that Christianity and many world religions have struggled with and wrestled with for hundreds of years, and something that we can bring into that conversation.
Just to follow up, I think Liz's point about genetic engineering is completely correct. So, for instance, if we think about the example of autism, there's a group of political advocates right now who are saying that no, autistic people should actually be the ones in charge of government because they're not as emotional as other people, right? So this idea of normalcy, right, and what it is that we take to be the most beneficial, not everyone has the same ideas about what those things are. And so allowing groups to say, I know, accentuate given traits would raises a whole host of other questions that we should probably talk about lunch, and not now. But the second thing is I think we need to broaden our kind of cultural stories about a lot of these things. So for instance, in my scholarly research, I've been kind of incredibly enriched by my look into Latin American positivism, especially into kind of the wealth of research that happened within the 19th century, especially in Mexico, on things like genetics and like Darwinism, right? Which was a whole religion and science conversation that it kind of where I am now, I kind of had to discover, because there's no line of scholars from those scholars to me. So I have to kind of go back and recover that and be like, oh no, this has always been a part of my Latino heritage, of this rich religion and science conversation. So I think there seemed a need for scholarly work to say like, no, this is something that really is a part of us, because something that I frankly encountered in the academy is like, oh, your research into transhumanism is not something that's like culturally relevant. And I couldn't disagree more, because I think this affects all of us a great deal.